Sunday in America was never just another square on the calendar. It was a pause, a collective breath, a day when time itself seemed to slow, as if the country had silently agreed to move at a different rhythm. And for decades, no one questioned it. But one quiet question lingered beneath the surface. What happens when a society forgets how to stop? In the early morning hours, before most cities fully woke, suburban streets rested in near silence. Lawns were still damp with dew. Curtains glowed softly as sunlight filtered through thin fabric. There were no rushing engines, no honking horns, no sense of urgency. Even footsteps sounded lighter, more deliberate. It felt as though noise itself had been asked to wait. But was this calm chosen, or inherited without thought? Across towns and neighborhoods, families followed patterns so familiar they barely felt conscious. Shirts were pressed the night before. Shoes were polished, not for appearance but for ritual. Cars rolled slowly toward churches, parking in the same spots they had occupied for years. When bells rang, they did more than announce a service. They marked belonging. Why did this shared movement matter so deeply to so many people? Inside the churches, the air carried the scent of old wood and lingering perfume. Hymns echoed softly, filling spaces built not just for sound, but for memory. People rose and sat together, a choreography learned over lifetimes. Children fidgeted, adults stared ahead, and yet something invisible connected them all. These moments weren't dramatic or loud, they were steady. And perhaps that steadiness was the point. But when stability feels permanent, does anyone notice when it begins to crack? Sunday afternoons unfolded differently, yet just as predictably. Living rooms became gathering places, televisions flickered to life. Football games played not merely as entertainment, but as ritualized release. For a few hours, the pressures of the week loosened their grip. Fathers sank into armchairs. Children sprawled across carpets. Mothers moved quietly between rooms, half present, half observing. This wasn't celebration. It was shared stillness. But was togetherness real if no one spoke? The sensory details mattered more than anyone realized at the time. The smell of coffee brewing, the faint pop of corn kernels, the rustle of newspapers folded and unfolded again. Outside, leaves stirred in the wind, while inside, conversations thinned into silence. Millions of people watched the same games, the same plays, the same moments, all at once. Yet beneath that unity lay a quiet question. Were they connecting, or merely coexisting? For years, this rhythm went unquestioned. Sunday didn't need defending. It simply existed. It was where the week ended and began again. But by the late 1960s, something subtle shifted. Attendance declined, not dramatically, quietly. A missed service here, a skipped gathering there. Young people lingered longer in bed, or left early, or didn't return at all. No announcements were made, no alarm sounded, but something essential was loosening its hold. Why did no one stop to ask why? To the younger generation, Sundays began to feel restrictive, an obligation inherited rather than chosen, a day defined by rules instead of meaning. The rituals their parents clung to felt outdated, even oppressive. And slowly, the idea of a sacred day began to clash with a culture moving faster, louder and more independently. When freedom becomes the highest value, what happens to tradition? Television, once a companion to Sunday afternoons, started to compete with it. New programming, new distractions, new reasons to stay home. Shopping centers tested Sunday openings. Work schedules bent and shifted. The line between weekday and weekend blurred. The pause that once felt natural began to feel inconvenient. And when society removes its pauses, does it ever truly rest? What made this change so powerful was its silence. There was no single moment of collapse, no speech, no headline declaring the end of Sunday as America knew it. Instead, meaning drained away gradually, like color fading from an old photograph. People didn't notice what they were losing. because nothing seemed to be taken. But absence, when ignored long enough, reshapes everything. By the early 1970s, Sunday still existed in name, but its weight was lighter, its authority weaker, its purpose unclear. Families still gathered, but less often. Communities still met, but with less certainty. The rituals remained, but the reasons behind them grew thin. And beneath this transformation lay a deeper uncertainty. If a nation no longer shares a day of stillness, what does it share at all? No one could yet see where this erosion would lead. They only felt the discomfort of change without understanding its cost. The sacred had not vanished. It had simply gone unnoticed. And history has shown that the most powerful losses are the ones that arrive quietly. Because once Sunday stopped holding time still, something else began to move faster than anyone expected. And America was not prepared for what followed. Sunday had once arrived with certainty. Not excitement, not fear, but expectation. People knew exactly what the day demanded of them. And for decades, that expectation had been enough. But by the early 1960s, something subtle began to shift. Almost too quietly to notice. The question was no longer what happens on Sunday, but why it still should. In many American homes, the routine remained intact on the surface. Clothes were still prepared the night before. Alarm clocks were still set earlier than usual. Cars still pulled out of driveways in neat, predictable lines. Yet inside those cars, the silence felt different. Conversations shortened. Children stared out the windows longer. Adults tightened their grip on the steering wheel. Was this still devotion? Or had it become performance? Inside the churches, attendance numbers looked stable, but attention did not. Eyes wandered, minds drifted. The words spoken from the pulpit felt increasingly distant from the world waiting outside those doors. Vietnam dominated the news. Civil rights marches filled the streets. Assassinations shattered the illusion of moral certainty. How could one quiet hour possibly contain all of that turmoil? For younger generations, Sunday began to feel heavy, not sacred, restrictive. They had grown up watching rules questioned and authority challenged. To them, tradition no longer meant safety. It meant limitation. And when obligation starts to feel like confinement, escape becomes inevitable. But where does a society escape when it abandons its rituals? By the mid-1960s, small acts of rebellion appeared. A skipped service here, a late arrival there. Some families replaced church with extended breakfasts. Others stayed home entirely, curtains drawn, radios low. These choices felt private, harmless, yet multiplied across millions of households. They quietly rewired the meaning of the day. Did anyone realize what was being dismantled? Sunday afternoons, once predictable, grew fragmented. Football remained, but it no longer unified everyone in the same way. Some watched obsessively, others ignored it entirely. Television expanded its grip, offering endless alternatives to shared time. Instead of gathering, families scattered into separate rooms, separate interests, separate inner worlds. When togetherness becomes optional, does it slowly disappear? The sensory texture of Sunday changed as well. The sound of church bells faded in some neighborhoods, replaced by lawnmowers, radios, distant traffic. The smell of roast dinners gave way to convenience food. Time itself felt looser, less defined. Without clear boundaries, the day stretched, but lost its shape. And without shape, meaning struggled to survive. Parents sensed something slipping, but struggled to name it. They spoke of changing times and different priorities. What they rarely admitted was fear. Fear that their children were growing up without the anchors that once held communities together. If Sunday no longer taught patience, restraint, and shared purpose, what would replace those lessons? For many, Sunday became an escape from pressure rather than a pause from it. Sleep replaced structure. Entertainment replaced reflection. Freedom replaced obligation. And at first it felt good. Relief often does. But relief is temporary. And when it fades, what remains? By the end of the decade, America still had Sundays. but it no longer shared a reason for them. What had once pulled people inward toward each other now pushed them outward into individual choices and private meanings. And as obligation dissolved, a deeper question surfaced, one that would define the decades to come. When a society stops agreeing on why it gathers, what keeps it from drifting apart? Sunday once belonged to everyone, not in ownership, but in rhythm. It was the only day when time slowed collectively, when an entire society moved at roughly the same pace. But by the early 1970s, something subtle yet irreversible began to happen. Time stopped waiting for people to catch up. Clocks didn't change, but expectations did. Factories demanded overtime. Retail discovered profit in 7-day weeks. Newspapers arrived heavier, filled with ads screaming urgency. And quietly, without a single announcement, Sunday began to feel late. Late to work, late to progress, late to a future that no longer paused. Families felt it first, even if they couldn't explain it. Breakfasts grew shorter, conversations felt rushed. There was a sense that something else needed attention, something invisible but pressing. The question lingered unspoken. What are we falling behind on? In many households, fathers who once guarded Sunday as untouchable began making exceptions. Just this once, just this shift, just this call. The line between necessity and choice blurred. When work crept into Sunday, it didn't arrive violently. It slipped in politely, asking for very little at first. But what it took in return was time that never came back. Mothers noticed the change differently. Sunday had once been a day of emotional maintenance, cooking slower meals, checking in without urgency, observing small silences. Now even rest felt scheduled. There was laundry to finish, errands to catch up on, preparations for Monday. Rest no longer meant stillness. It meant productivity without pay. When did resting become another task? Children, meanwhile, sensed the fracture without understanding it. Sunday used to feel different. Heavier, quieter, safer. Now it felt unpredictable. Sometimes sacred, sometimes empty. Sometimes busy in a way that felt wrong. The day lost its identity before they ever learned its meaning. How do you miss something you were never taught to name? Across neighborhoods the shift echoed. Churches noticed declining attendance not in dramatic drops, but in patterns. The same families missing, the same pews slowly emptying. The bell still rang, but fewer people responded. Faith wasn't necessarily lost. Attention was. And attention once divided rarely returns whole. Community leaders tried to adapt. Services shortened, messages softened, rituals adjusted to modern schedules. But adaptation carried a cost. The more flexible Sunday became, the less it stood for anything firm. Was survival quietly erasing significance? Outside, Sundays grew louder. More traffic, open stores, commercial radio replacing quiet streets. The hum of engines filled what used to be reflective silence. This noise wasn't chaos. It was normalization. And normalization made resistance feel unreasonable. Who complains about convenience? Television. Once the centerpiece of shared leisure, changed as well. Programming multiplied. Channels expanded. Choice replaced unity. Families no longer watch together. They watch simultaneously, separately. The living room fractured into corners of distraction. If everyone was entertained, why did it feel lonelier? Sociologists would later describe this as fragmentation, but those living through it felt something simpler. Disconnection. Not dramatic, not painful at first, just a mild absence. A sense that something expected never arrived, like waiting for a familiar knock that never comes. How long does it take before you stop listening for it? By mid-decade, Sunday had lost its authority. It no longer dictated behavior. It negotiated. And negotiation always favors urgency over meaning. When everything demands attention, what deserves it most? There was no villain in this story. No single decision. No moment of collapse. Just thousands of small compromises made by millions of people trying to keep up. But together those compromises dismantled something ancient, a shared pause. And when a society loses its pause, it doesn't just lose rest, it loses reflection, it loses memory, it loses the space where identity quietly forms. Sunday was still there, but it no longer held people together. So if time no longer belonged to everyone, who did it belong to now? Sunday did not disappear all at once. It learned to wait. At first, it simply lost its urgency. The morning bells still rang, but fewer people hurried to answer them. Breakfast tables stretched longer, coffee cups refilled without concern for time. The day no longer demanded participation. It merely suggested it. And when a ritual stops asking to be honored, how long does it survive on memory alone? By the early 1970s, America was learning a new relationship with time. The work week grew heavier, longer, more exhausting. Factories demanded overtime. Offices followed productivity charts instead of daylight. Sunday, once a release, began to feel like an interruption. And quietly, people started to negotiate with it. Just this once, next week, we'll go later. But what happens when postponement becomes the rule rather than the exception? In many homes, the change was subtle enough to deny. Church clothes remained in closets, untouched but not discarded. Football still played in the background, but conversations drifted elsewhere. The shared rhythm fractured into parallel silences, each person occupying the same room, yet living a separate Sunday. Was togetherness still happening, or had it become a performance repeated out of habit? Television schedules began to shift. Programming no longer respected the stillness of Sunday afternoons. Commercials grew louder, brighter, more urgent. Consumption crept into a space once reserved for reflection. The screen did not ask for patience or belief, only attention. And attention, unlike faith, was easier to give away. But what did it take in return? Outside, neighborhoods no longer moved as one body. Lawns were mowed at different hours. Cars came and went unpredictably. The sense of shared pause dissolved. There was no longer a moment when an entire street felt suspended in the same breath. When did America stop resting together? And why did no one announce it? For older generations, the loss felt personal. Not dramatic, not loud, just deeply unsettling. Sunday had been the one day when children slowed down enough to be seen, when parents felt briefly necessary, when silence meant safety. Without it, the week blurred. Time accelerated, and many quietly wondered, if even Sunday can be replaced, what else is temporary? Younger generations felt something different, relief. To them, Sunday had carried expectations without explanation. Sit still, listen, wait, behave. The new world offered freedom instead of structure, choice instead of obligation. But freedom without anchors often drifts. And few noticed how quickly drifting turned into disconnection. There were moments when communities tried to reclaim the day. Neighborhood picnics, youth leagues, informal gatherings meant to replace what had been lost. But replacements lacked weight. They did not carry history. They did not echo. And rituals without memory rarely survive pressure. Why did every attempt to recreate Sunday feel thinner than the one before? As the decade progressed, Sunday became flexible, dangerously so. It could be moved, shortened, ignored. It bent around schedules instead of shaping them. And once a sacred boundary becomes adjustable, it stops protecting what lies within it. What was Sunday shielding that America no longer believed needed protection? By the mid-1970s, something else emerged. Guilt. People sensed the loss, but could not name it. They felt disconnected without knowing from what. Families spent time together, yet remembered nothing distinct about it. The day passed without friction and without meaning. Was peace ever meant to be this empty? Sunday still existed, but it no longer waited for anyone. And in that quiet surrender, a deeper question began to form. One that would not be answered in churches or living rooms, but in the long-term shape of American life itself. If a nation abandons its shared pause, What replaces the silence? Sunday did not disappear all at once. It eroded slowly, almost politely, until no one could point to the exact moment it stopped feeling sacred. There were no announcements, no protests, no final bell ringing to mark its end. Instead, it faded the way habits do. Quietly, gradually, and without resistance. By the early 1970s, the rhythm of Sunday had begun to fracture. Families still woke up in the morning, but fewer of them prepared with purpose. Church clothes remained in closets. Breakfast grew quieter, less ceremonial. The day still existed, but it no longer commanded obedience. And when a ritual loses its authority, what replaces it? Across American suburbs, something subtle had changed. Fathers who once rose early now lingered in bed. Children who once dressed without complaint now questioned why they had to go anywhere at all. Mothers noticed the shift first, not because they were more observant, but because they were the ones holding the routine together. When the routine weakened, they felt it immediately. Television schedules adapted faster than people did. Sunday programming expanded, brightened, competed. Networks learned that attention no longer needed permission. Football was still there, but it was no longer the anchor of the day. It became just another option. Choice replaced tradition, and choice once introduced rarely retreats. In many homes, Sunday afternoons grew louder, not quieter. Music played, doors opened and closed, friends dropped by without ceremony. The enforced stillness of the past gave way to movement. At first, this felt like freedom. But freedom from what exactly? For decades, Sunday had functioned as a boundary. It separated labor from rest, urgency from reflection. When that boundary weakened, the days began to blur. Monday no longer felt like a return. It felt like a continuation. The week became one long stretch of motion, unbroken by pause. And something essential was lost in that continuity. Sociologists would later describe this period as a shift toward individual time. But for the families living through it, the change felt far more personal. Conversations shortened, meals fragmented, shared silence became rare. People were together more often, yet felt strangely alone. How could connection increase while closeness declined? Church attendance continued to fall, but not dramatically. It declined in inches, not miles. One missed Sunday became two. Two became a month. A month became absence. No guilt accompanied the change, only adjustment. And once adjusted, few felt compelled to return. The older generation noticed. They spoke of discipline, respect, tradition. They warned that something fragile was breaking. But their language no longer resonated. To younger ears, it sounded outdated, moralistic, unnecessary. The world was moving faster now. Why slow it down for one day? In cities, Sunday lost its visual difference. Stores opened, traffic increased. Construction resumed. The quiet streets of the past existed now only in memory. Noise filled the gaps that silence once occupied. And in that noise, reflection had no place to land. Yet even as the ritual faded, its absence created a pressure no one expected. People grew restless without understanding why. Anxiety increased, but its source remained unclear. Time felt scarce. Even when schedules were full, without a shared pause, life accelerated beyond control. Was this progress or erosion? Some families attempted to preserve fragments. A late lunch, a shared walk, an unplugged hour, but fragments lack the power of structure. Without collective agreement, individual efforts felt fragile. One phone call could undo them. One errand could erase them. The sacred cannot survive without protection. By the mid-1970s, Sunday had become a mirror rather than a command. It reflected how people already lived instead of guiding how they should live. And mirrors, unlike rules, do not argue. They only show what is already there. The day that once asked people to stop, now asks nothing at all. And in that silence of expectation, a deeper question emerged. Not about Sunday, but about time itself. If no day was set apart, if no pause was guaranteed, where would meaning be allowed to settle? America did not answer this question immediately. It kept moving, but something was building beneath the surface, a fatigue that would soon demand attention, whether the culture was ready or not. Sunday did not disappear overnight. It weakened slowly, quietly, almost politely. The kind of disappearance that feels harmless until it's too late. No alarm sounded. No one gathered to mourn it. It simply stopped holding people together the way it once had. And when that bond loosened, something fundamental inside American life began to drift apart. By the mid-1970s, Sunday no longer commanded obedience. It negotiated. Families didn't plan their week around it anymore. They squeezed it between errands, overtime shifts, children's schedules, and exhaustion. What had once been a fixed point became optional. And when something sacred becomes optional, it rarely survives intact. Church attendance declined first. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough to be noticeable. Empty pews appeared like missing teeth. Pastors adjusted sermons, shortened services, softened the language. Faith was still present, but urgency was gone. People stopped asking, "What does this day demand of us?" and started asking, "Is this worth our time?" And once that question was asked, the answer kept changing. At home, Sunday afternoons felt different now. Televisions were still on, but attention was fractured. The game played in the background while paperwork spread across the table. Children drifted in and out of the room. Fathers watched but without ceremony. Mothers moved through the house, already thinking about Monday. Togetherness was still happening, but thinner, quieter, distracted. The rituals hadn't vanished. They had lost their authority. Sunday dinners, once sacred and immovable, became flexible, later, faster, sometimes skipped entirely. Frozen meals replaced slow cooking. Conversations shortened. Silence filled the spaces where stories once lived. Families were still in the same rooms, but no longer fully present with one another, and no one could quite explain when that shift had occurred. Outside the home, the economy pressed in. Factories demanded overtime. Retail expanded into weekends. Hospitals, offices, service industries, they no longer paused for tradition. Sunday became just another slot on the calendar. A day to catch up. A day to hustle quietly. A day that belonged to productivity instead of reflection. For working-class families especially, Sunday stopped being restorative. It became necessary labor disguised as choice. Miss the shift, lose the hours. Lose the hours, lose the security. And slowly the idea of a shared national pause collapsed under financial pressure. What replaced it was individual survival. The language changed too. People stopped saying the Lord's Day or even Family Day. They said my day. Off. Ownership shifted inward. Sunday no longer belonged to the community. It belonged to the individual. And individuals, unlike traditions, don't move in sync. By the late 1970s, children no longer learned Sunday as a rhythm. They learned it as an absence. An unstructured day, a day without shape. They didn't miss what they had never been taught to value. And without memory, nostalgia cannot form. Something essential was being lost. Not belief, not faith, not family, but shared meaning. The quiet truth was this: Sunday had once trained Americans how to slow down together. It taught restraint, patience, presence. Without it, time accelerated. Life fragmented. People stayed busy, but felt increasingly hollow. Connected but isolated. No one called it a crisis, but it was one. Because when a society loses its pause, it forgets how to breathe. And soon, that loss would collide with something even more powerful than tradition: technology. Sunday did not disappear all at once. It didn't collapse in a single generation, or vanish with a dramatic announcement. It faded, quietly, politely, almost apologetically. By the mid-1970s, Sunday in America was no longer a rule. It was a choice, and that single shift changed everything. In many homes, the alarm clock still rang, but fewer people obeyed them. Church clothes stayed on hangers. Breakfast stretched longer. Some families still gathered, but others drifted. Each member pulled in a different direction by invisible currents of modern life, and no one seemed certain when togetherness stopped being expected and started feeling optional. The streets told the story before anyone spoke it out loud. Parking lots outside churches no longer filled the way they once had. A few empty spaces appeared at first, then entire rows. Congregations grew quieter, older, smaller. The rituals remained the same, but the faces changed, and then slowly disappeared. What happens to a ritual when the next generation never fully learns why it mattered? Sunday afternoons changed too. Football was still played, still watched, still loved, but no longer universally. Some televisions stayed off. Others competed with errands, part-time jobs, homework, or exhaustion. The shared national rhythm fractured into personal schedules. Everyone was busy, yet fewer people felt connected. How did a day once designed for rest become just another source of pressure? Economic reality played its role. As wages stagnated and costs rose, Sundays became workdays for millions. Retail expanded. Restaurants stayed open. Closed on Sunday signs vanished from windows across the country. The promise of convenience replaced the promise of pause. And with that change came a question no one asked directly. If rest is no longer protected, can it survive at all? Inside homes, the emotional shift was subtle but profound. Conversations grew shorter. Meals were eaten at different times. Children learned early that schedules mattered more than rituals. Parents told themselves they would make time later, unaware that later rarely comes. Was this freedom, or the slow erosion of something irreplaceable? Sundays had once acted as emotional glue. They did not solve problems, but they held people still long enough to face them together. Without that pause, conflicts lingered unresolved. Stress spilled into every day. Families adapted, but adaptation came at a cost. When there is no shared silence, where does reflection go? For some, abandoning Sunday rituals felt like progress. Old rules loosened. Personal choice expanded. Tradition no longer dictated behavior. But beneath that liberation, something quieter surfaced. A sense of drift. Without a common anchor, individuals floated alone. And while freedom promised individuality, it often delivered isolation. Could a society survive without shared moments of meaning? Communities noticed the change before institutions did. Volunteer groups struggled. Local events shrank. Neighborhood familiarity weakened. People still lived near one another, but no longer truly knew one another. The question was no longer, where will we meet? But why should we? And without an answer, distance grew. By the late 1970s, Sunday was still there, printed on calendars, named on schedules, but its emotional authority had vanished. It no longer slowed time. It no longer demanded presence. It no longer insisted that people belong to something larger than themselves. And when a culture stops insisting, things quietly fall apart. Yet even as Sunday became optional, traces of longing remained. Older generations spoke of how it used to feel. Younger ones sensed something missing but could not name it. There was nostalgia without memory, absence without explanation. Could something be mourned even if it was never fully known? Sunday did not die. It was set aside, and what replaced it was busyness. Louder, faster, and far less forgiving. But the story does not end there, because when something meaningful disappears, it leaves behind a shape, and sooner or later, people begin to notice the emptiness. The question was no longer whether Sunday would return as it once was. The question was far more unsettling. What happens to a society that never truly rests? No one announced the end of Sunday rituals. There was no speech, no official decision, no final gathering to mark the moment. They simply stopped waiting for Sunday. By the late 1970s, the change was no longer subtle. It was visible in parking lots that stayed half empty, in churches where familiar faces quietly disappeared, and in living rooms where televisions flickered alone. The sacred day still arrived, every 7 days, but fewer people rearranged their lives around it. What happened when a society stopped pausing together? Factories began running on Sundays. Retail lights turned on earlier each year. Employers spoke the language of flexibility. But workers felt something else entirely: erosion. The promise of rest gave way to schedules, shifts, and paychecks that no longer respected the boundary between labor and life. Was progress worth the quiet cost no one calculated? For families, Sunday once acted as a reset button. Arguments paused. Distance softened. Even unresolved tensions had rules. They could wait until Monday. But now, with everyone moving on different schedules, conflicts bled into every day. Meals were eaten alone. Conversations shortened. How long could a family stay connected without shared time? Children noticed first. They no longer asked what time church started or which game would be on. Sundays became indistinguishable from Saturdays, or worse, from Mondays. When rituals vanish, what replaces them for the next generation? In many homes, silence took on a different meaning. It was no longer peaceful. It was empty. The hum of refrigerators replaced conversation. Football games played to rooms with no audience. Fathers sat alone in chairs once claimed hours before kickoff. Mothers worked through laundry instead of pausing. Was this freedom or quiet fragmentation? Communities felt it too. Without a shared rhythm, neighbors became strangers. Doors stayed closed longer. Familiar waves turned into polite nods, then disappeared entirely. When people stopped showing up together, how long before they stopped caring together? Religion was often blamed, but belief was only part of the story. What truly faded was not faith, but structure. Sunday had provided something secular societies underestimated: a collective breath. When that breath disappeared, stress filled the space. Why did no one see the pressure building? Media filled the gap quickly. Endless channels, endless choices. Entertainment promised connection, but delivered distraction. People consumed more but shared less. The question was no longer, what are we doing together? It became, what am I watching alone? By the early 1980s, nostalgia had already begun. Articles appeared asking when families stopped eating together. Commentators wondered why communities felt colder, yet few connected the feeling to the loss of ritual. How do you mourn something when you don't know what you lost? Sunday still existed, but now it competed. With work, with errands, with noise, and competition slowly erodes meaning. Could something survive if it was never defended? Some tried to hold on. Small churches, local leagues, families who insisted on tradition. But holding against the current required effort, and effort was in short supply. When did rest become something you had to fight for? The generation that remembered sacred Sundays grew quieter. They stopped explaining, stopped insisting. They watched the calendar turn while something intangible slipped away. Did they believe resistance was pointless? Or did they simply grow tired? And yet beneath the surface the loss left traces. Rising burnout, loneliness statistics, a hunger for balance that no one could define. Society searched for solutions without naming the wound. How do you heal what you refuse to acknowledge? Sunday was never just about religion. It was about permission. To stop, to gather, to belong without earning it. When that permission vanished, something fundamental shifted. The question was no longer whether Sunday would return. It was whether modern life would ever allow another shared pause to take its place. And that question remains unanswered. By the 1980s, Sunday was just another day with better lighting. Stores opened, work crept in. The idea of a sacred pause began to feel outdated, even naive. Productivity replaced presence. Choice replaced obligation. Freedom replaced rhythm. And yet, something subtle followed. An unease, a restlessness, a sense of always arriving somewhere late. Communities weakened without realizing why. Loneliness grew despite constant connection. People spoke more but shared less. The spaces where strangers once felt like neighbors quietly collapsed. Sunday had once been the invisible thread stitching individual. Leaves into something communal. When it unraveled, the fabric didn't tear. It thinned. And thin fabric doesn't announce when it finally gives way. Looking back, historians would later argue that the loss of Sunday rituals was no religious shift, but a cultural one. It marked the moment when time stopped belonging to people and began owning them instead. What disappeared was not faith, it was rhythm. And rhythm, once broken, is difficult to restore. Today, traces remain. In the way people feel nostalgic without knowing why. In the longing for slowness they can't justify. In the quiet discomfort of free time that feels undeserved. Sunday still exists, but it no longer gathers anyone. And perhaps that is the quietest tragedy of all. Not that something sacred was taken away, but that it faded so gently, no one thought to hold on to it.